So apparently even turning on a microphone is too technically difficult for me, so I'm just going to repeat the last thing that I said, which was which was that we're going to have all of the speakers speak with a few breaks in between. And then what we'd like to do is to gather all of the questions at the end so that we can have a really robust panel discussion and Q&A segment, both here live and also online. We have next up Peter Hagell, RN and PhD, Professor of Neurological Caring Science. I love that. At Kristianstad University in Sweden. He has a clinical background as a neuroscience nurse subspecialized in Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders. His research is conducted in national and international collaboration, and he has published more than 80 peer-reviewed papers in international scientific journals. Peter is the recipient of the Swedish Parkinson's Disease Association's Medal of Honor, the World Federation of Neuroscience Nurses Agnes Marshall Research Award, and the New Investigator Award from the International Society for Quality of Life Research. He teaches research methodology, statistics, and psychometrics at the undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate levels. So please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you very much. Did I manage to switch the microphone on? Good.
Is yours on?
Yeah. It seems like it is. Thank you. And thanks for letting me have the opportunity to be here today. It's an extremely interesting and very important seminar that we are gathering at this evening. I will talk about person-centeredness from perhaps a slightly different perspective than what we typically hear about, and that is from the perspective of measuring outcomes in clinical trials for Parkinson's disease. Outcome measurement in clinical trials, typically, if we look at publications where people evaluate the effectiveness, efficiency of various treatments, the vast majority of those studies are using some kind of rating scale in trying to evaluate the effectiveness or efficacy of that treatment. So it might be good to just take a minute or so and think about what is a rating scale then? Well, it generally looks something like this, where in this case this is a self-reported rating scale, meaning that the person with Parkinson's disease, him or herself, is supposed to read this through and indicate to what extent, in this case, how often he or she experiences each of the problems mentioned in the respective items. It might also be, in another situation, it might be a rating scale where the clinician is looking through this list of items, indicating how severe that symptom or problem is perceived to be for the patient. And what happens then is that when we collect these data, we turn these answers, these tick marks, crosses and so on, into numerical codes. We turn these marks into integers that we use to add up for the respective responses that the patient or clinician has responded, to provide us with a sum score that, assuming that each of these items that we have been asking are related to one common variable, that this sum score represents a measure of some sort regarding that phenomenon, in which we try to locate individuals on a scale from less to more regarding whatever it is we're asking about, so that we can compare people to one another and see what has happened after we have introduced a new treatment, for example. Has this person moved in this direction and experiencing more health in whatever aspect that might be. Now for this is a perfectly legitimate method. It has been around, roughly speaking, for 125 years, developed in the behavioral sciences in order to quantify and measure complex constructs. But in order for it to work and be appropriate as outcome measures in clinical trials where we're trying to understand and decide whether a therapy is useful or not for people with a chronic disorder, it requires certain things. Well, I'd say there are lots of things, but we may boil it down to a few requirements. These scales need to represent rigorous measurements or measures of the things that we are interested in measuring. And they also should preferably target variables, phenomena that are in line with what the intended treatment or therapy is targeting. Otherwise, we will most certainly have problems evaluating the efficacy of that treatment. And arguably, it should also represent variables or phenomena that are the most important to people with the disorder, in this case Parkinson's disease. And this final point is where what I will focus on this evening. A few years ago, this piece was published in the British Medical Journal, where Dr. Ian Chalmers wrote a viewpoint regarding recent developments in therapy for Alzheimer's disease. And he wrote this piece both as a member of the R&D Advisory Committee of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, but he also wrote it as someone whose father had suffered from Alzheimer's disease. So he had two perspectives here. And when what he does in this little piece is that he discusses the results and so on from a number of recent clinical trials of new therapies for Alzheimer's disease. And he says that the main problem, and here he's speaking mainly as a family member of someone with Alzheimer's disease, main problem was that we couldn't interpret the outcome measures from research studies, often scales of some sort, although sufficient to ensure drug marketing licenses, they had little practical meaning. So I think he's pointing out a very important thing here. What does it mean? We see results saying that scale A improved, the patients improved according to scale A by this and that number. What does that mean for the life of people with the disorder? And since this came out, and also before Dr. Chalmers wrote this, there has been an increasing number of papers published in the scientific literature discussing the need for patient involvement also in outcome measurement. And sort of the baseline message here, like in other patient-centeredness discussions, is that by doing so, we may actually achieve better research and research that is more meaningful. I'd like to illustrate the problem that surrounds outcome measurement in this perspective by looking at a clinical trial. This is a published trial. I won't mention the drug, I won't mention the publication. But it's about an adjunct therapy, a treatment that is given in addition to L-DOPA when people with Parkinson's disease begins to experience wearing off and on-off fluctuations in order to smoothen out the therapeutic response. And this trial had two main endpoints, one being activities of daily living and the other being quality of life. And we're going to start by looking at the activities of daily living part of this study and see what happened. This is a classical clinical trial. People with Parkinson's disease were recruited as participants. Half of them were randomized to receive L-DOPA plus the active new drug, and the other half was randomized to receive L-DOPA and placebo, an inactive pill. The main outcome measure for activities of daily living was this scale. It's part of a system of scales called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. This is part 2, labeled activities of daily living. So this was used as the main outcome measure. So people were rated according to this scale before starting the therapy, and then after being on the treatment for a while. And the results were compared, and what happened was that a very significant difference was shown. That is, statistically, it could be shown that there was a difference between the two treatment groups in favor of those people who received the active compound. And the authors concluded that this drug has good efficacy in terms of activities of daily living. Fine. However, going back to those data, we can see that the difference between the two groups was 1.6 on this rating scale. What does that mean? No one knows. What does this scale really measure? What's hidden underneath those numbers? Well, we don't really know. It says activities of daily living at the top of the scale, but what do the numbers represent? That's less clear. Work from Umeå, for example, illustrates this when they looked at this particular scale and linked it to the World Health Organization's ICF system, which defines, among other things, activities and activity performance. And I could see that only about half of the things that this scale assesses has to do with activity performance at all. Furthermore, reading this report, one realizes that they had in addition to this scale, they had 2 additional scales also reportedly targeting activities of daily living. The Schwab in England scale and a scale from something called the PDQ-39, which I'll come back to later. Looking at those results, there were no differences between the two groups for either of those 2 other scales. So 1 out of 3 shows one thing, 2 out of 3 shows another thing. Question is there good efficacy in terms of activities of daily living? So, what outcomes are important to assess from what I would like to refer to as an end-user perspective? And by end-user, I ultimately think of people with the disorder as the ultimate end-user in terms of a clinical trial, because these are the people who will or will not receive the new therapy. But another important end-user group is also clinicians, the people who, hopefully in collaboration with patients, discuss and decide what kind of treatment might be best. So we have done a couple of studies trying to get to this. What outcomes are important to consider? In one of these studies, I realized this might be difficult to see, but I will tell you what you don't see, hopefully. We looked at what things, symptoms and problems in Parkinson's disease seem to be predictive of patient self-reported illness-related distress. And overall, we found that, see if I can make this not run around. Overall, we found that the most predictive symptoms or problems regarding illness-related distress were fatigue, sleep problems, depression, and pain. And looking at motor symptoms, the classical things that people think about regarding Parkinson's disease, we found that none of the primary symptoms, such as tremor or slowness per se, contributed, but instead what did contribute was mobility, being able to walk. Other researchers have also looked at this. This is a study from the United States, where they asked people to rate the importance of evaluating these 10 symptoms when measuring outcomes in therapeutic trials. And what they found was that the most important highly rated symptom or problem was walking, and followed by slowness, ADL, fatigue, sleep, stiffness, and so on. This is, of course, very interesting and valuable information. However, one potential problem with doing a survey like this is that for some reason the investigators were quite convinced that they knew best which 10 things to consider in the first place. One may challenge that, which we attempted to do in some studies that we recently conducted, where we set out to try to develop a conceptual framework or conceptually map out areas that were regarding outcomes that were considered prioritized by people with Parkinson's disease and clinicians, and also to determine the relative importance of these areas for outcome measurement in clinical trials for Parkinson's disease. What we used was a methodology that combines quantitative and qualitative method, and this approach is called something called concept mapping. And what happens in this approach is that you run a number of focus groups where we let people come together and discuss a common theme. In this case, a sort of a question, which was about important areas for outcome measurement. They brainstorm regarding this, come up with a list of statements in response to this question, and then these statements are sorted conceptually and also rated regarding their importance. And in this case, in this study, we used focus groups consisting of patients, clinicians, and also one small focus group consisting of preclinical researchers working on disease mechanisms and development of new therapies to come up with what are the important outcomes to consider in Parkinson's disease. These groups together produced 99 statements, 99 things that are important to consider when thinking about therapeutic outcomes in Parkinson's disease. And when we looked at the results from people with Parkinson's and healthcare professionals separately, this is what those 99 statements look like if we map them out regarding how people thought they related to one another. So statements down here had much in common, and this statement here does not have very much in common with a dot over here. This is the map from people with Parkinson's disease. This is the clinician's map. When we analyze this statistically, we can group them into 8 clusters each. And what is interesting to see here, just looking at the map, is that the map from people with Parkinson's disease tend to be much more scattered than that from clinician, which is more in itself. You can almost see the various clusters by just looking at it, which indicates that the impact of the disorder from a personal perspective, which we see here, is much more difficult to sort of differentiate into different aspects. And when we asked the patients to review these results that we had come up with. We collected a number of the original participants to review this together with us. What they did was that they could see that their map consisted of two main parts, one in the sort of southeast and one in the northwest, and in the middle were neuropsychiatric and emotional symptoms that sort of affected everything and linked everything together. Whereas the clinicians tended to make more boxes, and these are measurable aspects, these are more diffuse aspects that are concealed, and so on. And looking at the highest priorities from the two respective groups, we can see the quality of life is highly important from both perspectives, and followed by, from the patient perspective, walking, mobility, sleeping problems, and so on. So, going back to our study again, before I'm closing, the other main endpoint in this study was quality of life, which we have seen is considered very important. In this study, they used a questionnaire, a rating scale called a PDQ-39 to measure quality of life. They found no differences between the two groups, which then indicates that there is no advantage with this additional therapy in terms of people's quality of life. However, what does this scale measure? Well, we don't know. Several authors have looked at this and evaluated among patients as well, and they have found that it correlates very poorly to people's self-rated quality of life. Patients themselves feel unsure whether it actually reflects their situation. When we have asked people to assess the content of this scale, about a third think that major parts of its content is irrelevant to them, and half of them are missing important areas. And when we ask them to rate the relevance, they rate it fairly high, but interestingly enough, their clinicians, nurses and doctors, think it's more relevant than patients themselves. And again, it doesn't correlate with self-rated quality of life any better than duration of disease, for example. And when we have looked at these data with this scale, we have also found that the content, the actual questions of the scale, tend to represent worse health status than that experienced by people with Parkinson's disease. Which means that a lot of people are not really being measured with this scale, which would imply that it would be very difficult to measure any differences or changes in this area, which is exactly what we saw in the clinical trial that I have referred to. So, to sum up, there are obvious similarities in clinicians' views and patients' views regarding what outcomes to prioritize, but there are also important differences which we think simply reflects the two important differences in viewpoints: the lived experience versus the scholarly or biomedical perspective. If we want clinical trial results that are meaningful to end users, we need to think about what to measure. And to achieve better, more meaningful trials and results, our data and other people's data indicate that we should focus on quality of life, walking, sleep, fatigue, perceived disease control, and also fluctuations, depressions, and gait. And these results also have important implications in terms of dictating needs for new and better methods for measuring outcomes, and also, secondarily, in beginning to identifying priorities in terms of development of new therapies. So, with that, I hope I didn't talk too long. and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peter and Sara. Peter, I think in particular, your comments maybe begin to scratch the surface to explain why it is that when we do decide to partner, things might be so difficult. We have different maps and different lists and different words to describe our experience. But we're going to take a break now. And there are some refreshments for those of you who are here with us in person. For the rest of you who are joining us online, you're just going to have to fend for yourselves. See what you can find in the office kitchen or at home. And we will join you back here in 20 minutes and continue the conversation with Marianne Faber and John Stamford. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much.